So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first of the Remake Permanent Seminar Series. I am Massimiliano Guido. I am the principal investigator of Remake, together with my colleague Joe Spestra and from Gothenburg University, and Andrea Schiavio from York University. Remake, as you might know, is a new research platform for investigating the complexity of musical instruments and their interaction with different categories of people who interact with them, builders, performers, listeners, and restorers. And one of our main goals is to create a dialogue between historical objects that were significant for making music in the past with musical instruments that are still built today according to a wealth of praxis that have been reconstructed by organologists and musicologists, but also from artistic researchers and scientists around these objects. So it's with great pleasure that today we start with John Watson, one of our advisory board and experts, and I will leave the floor to my two colleagues, Joe Spestra and the PhD student Joe Thorburn from York, who will chair the seminar. I just put as a remind a link to our next initiative, an hybrid conference on musical instruments and technology happening in Bologna and online. The program is pretty rich and interesting, so if you are up to it, please sign and participate also to that. Thank you, and I'll give it to Joe.
Well, thank you very much, Max. And as Max mentioned there, my name is Joe Thornburn, and I'm one of the PhD students currently involved in the Remake project. And I'll be chairing this seminar series with the help of Joel, who is one of the PIs on the project. So I just want to give a very quick introduction to our first speaker, our esteemed first speaker today for our very first seminar series. That is John Watson, who is a conservator and curator of musical instruments, and has been responsible for online databases of early pianos and harpsichords and clavichords and their makers. In 2020, he received the Kurt Sachs Award for a lifetime contribution to organology, and in 2024 received the Anthony Baines Memorial Prize from the Gallopin Society. And his work has resulted in 34 reproduction instruments, which is very close to the work that Remake is doing, 3 books and numerous articles, including 2 pre-reading materials that you may have read regarding small upright piano from Pennsylvania and a 1793 Longman Broderip harpsichord. So just before I hand over quickly to John, just the way that this seminar will work. So John's going to give a presentation, and then afterwards we will have a Q&A and discussion section. So if you could please keep your microphones off for now, but please feel free to write any questions in the chat, and they will be brought to our attention, and we will work through them after the presentation has finished. So with that all being said, I think I will now hand over to John to give this seminar. And so, John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joe, and the Remake staff for the honor of presenting this first seminar in the series. I'd like to begin with 2 cautionary tales. There's a piece of American folklore about a beloved family recipe handed down through the generations. It's for a pot roast, and the recipe includes instruction to cut the ends off the meat before cooking. For generations, no one questions it until someone finally asks great-grandmother, "Why does the recipe say to cut the ends off the meat?" The great-grandmother laughs and says, "It's because my pan was not big enough." The story is canonical enough that sometimes it's actually referred to as the pot roast principle. So we ask ourselves, is some of our own work in copying historic musical instruments falling prey to the pot roast principle? Another story, not from folklore, but from my own inauspicious beginnings as a self-taught instrument maker, occurred as a student 54 years ago when I wanted a clavichord and could not afford to purchase even a kit version. So I literally made a copy of a Zuckerman kit clavichord. I was a novice, but I thought myself smarter than the kit designers and made some quote-unquote improvements, including an easier way to remove the keys by creating a big hole in the baseboard to enable dropping the keyboard out the bottom. As some of you know, the baseboard is the structural backbone of a clavichord, so mine would never have held string tension until I finally had to add a massive solid baseboard. This was the opposite of the pot roast principle, where some details in the original should not have been changed, even if I did not yet understand their purpose. These two stories are cautionary tales about deciding what to trust in our understanding of antique instruments. Understanding meaning is the challenge. Measuring all the parts with tape measures and calipers can tell us what they made, but to understand why they made it that way, we need to look at the instrument with a zoom lens, first focusing up close to the smallest minutiae, then zooming way out to view the world in which it was made, a world much different from our own. One of the underpinnings of the Remake project is that a musical instrument is not created in a vacuum, but is the result of a universe of circumstances. Not only is the original maker responsible for the material object, but the whole social, socioeconomic, cultural, technological, political, and personal world in which the instrument was made also had a hand in the result. So to understand the object, we need to investigate the relevant parts of that universe. Alas, that world is in the past. We've not yet achieved time travel, but what we do have is the remnants of the past. We can learn much by looking at the evidence that vanished world left behind. And the evidence is plentiful and ubiquitous and can literally be read like a book. A musical instrument thus has not one voice, but two. Besides the obvious musical voice for the ears, there's also a documentary voice, readable with all the other senses. All it takes is care to notice evidence for what it is and the right literacy to read it, as the instrument becomes a multi-volume encyclopedia of historical information, and written by none other than the instrument's actual historical maker. Today we'll look at examples of a few different kinds of evidence and my best efforts to interpret them. Any meaning I apply to a piece of evidence can never be more than a hypothesis. Any interpretation of historical evidence is provisional, and if we put our heads together, we can hope to come closer to a virtual encounter with the past, surely one of the aspirations of the Remake project. The first group of examples we'll consider are evidence that indicate workshop methods, and we'll begin with tool marks. This photo shows 4 key levers from a 1762 Kirkman harpsichord I was to copy for Colonial Williamsburg. Like most of the methods I'll feature today, this method of revealing evidence requires no costly scientific apparatus, here only a light shining at a raking light angle. Preparing to copy this keyboard, seeing these tool marks was almost like visiting the 1762 workshop as the keys were being made. We see the artisan at work, their tools arrayed on the bench. Some marks overlap others, indicating the sequence of steps. This evidence doesn't just give us a list of tools, but it tells a story. And the 2.5 centuries between you and him momentarily disappears. I used to think one could create a pictorial dictionary of tool marks, but interpreting this type of evidence partly relies on something that cannot be captured in photos and definitions. It involves the concept of artisanal epistemology, which is a visceral form of knowledge from making, doing, and hands-on practice. It's a type of knowledge in the hands more than in the mind. I can tell you what a draw knife is, how it works, and show photos of its tracks and old key levers. But physically use a draw knife to carve a limewood key lever with its vagaries of grain direction, and you will develop a more visceral understanding of the tool, and you'll then become more perceptive in recognizing its effects. That type of experiential learning also deepens the perception of historical evidence. This is called experimental archaeology. It's a means of understanding the material past through a sequence of observing evidence, reenacting the construction process, then, importantly, re-examining the evidence now with deeper perception. We can even see glimpses into the artist's mind, where we see evidence of priorities as he thinks to himself, this bit is important, so be fussy here, but don't waste too much time there. That's good enough. Go on to the next key. To our 21st century eyes, the workmanship in the hidden areas of historic instruments may seem crude and slapdash. It is certainly true they were smart enough to work as fast as possible to be competitive in business. But contrary to today's norms, their workmanship followed a hierarchy of standards. Time is not wasted on inconsequential surfaces, but the important details, whether visible or not, get whatever time, care, and skill they require. This was dramatized for me when I examined a 1766 Zumpa square piano I copied for the museum. Its keys seemed particularly crude on the undersides, but when I measured the distance between the balance mortise and the actual balance point of each key lever, consistently very near 32 millimeters, I realized Zumpa was not being the least slapdash. He knew what was important, the balancing of the keys, and what was not, the lower surface of the key lever. That evidence of Zumpa's thoughtful hierarchy could have been easily missed, but it's the kind of evidence that takes practice to notice, and it allows us to recognize the antique as an embodiment of a past world. It's my observation that an artisan's hierarchy of standards is the truest distinction between a master and a novice. Novices have trouble judging importance and are rarely careful enough in the most important steps, and often waste valuable time being fussy with unimportant ones. To judge what is truly important takes a lifetime to learn. So far, the tool marks we've looked at are informative, but not very surprising. Consider the method commonly used in keyboard workshops, using springy sticks called go bars that go between the ceiling and the work to apply pressure. They're especially convenient when gluing ribs to soundboards, as in this photo. Some years ago, an overconfident colleague informed me that they use go bars in France, but not in England. It was true no documentary evidence known to me indicated the use of go bars in England. But that same Kirkman harpsichord made in 1762 London had what seemed to be clear evidence of the use of go bars. Again, raking light revealed the footprints of go bars near the ends of the soundboard ribs viewed from underneath. The marks are plausibly left when a go bar is dragged across the surface of the rib. This was evidence that they did indeed use go bars in London. This instrument, by the way, had never had its interior exposed in modern times, so the marks date to the original construction. Had the instrument been through past restorations, such evidence could not have been trusted. Restoration often, though unintentionally, falsifies historical evidence. So did the Kirkman workshop use go bars when installing soundboards, as shown in this photo of a spinet in my shop? It's a practical method to do the job quickly before the hot hide glue chills. The answer came in the next example of physical evidence, and it shows that the shop did not use go bars to install the soundboard. How can we know? This is the tail edge of the soundboard in that 1762 harpsichord. The walnut hitchpin rail has been removed, revealing a profusion of holes. The large round hole is the dowel that fixes the hitchpin rail in place, and the smaller round holes are from the hitchpins. But what about these square holes, as we would expect of hand-forged nails? The nails themselves now absent. This evidence indicates another very practical method this workshop used to install soundboards, and I found it even faster than go bars. Before spreading the glue, we prepare enough strips of softwood to lay around the perimeter of the soundboard. Forged nails about 1 inch long are pre-positioned every few inches. Just have the strips of wood ready, so when the glue is spread and the soundboard is positioned, the strips can be quickly nailed in position around the soundboard perimeter to close the joint. After the glue is dry, the nails, which being forged, are naturally tapered and are easily pulled out, and the strip set aside for the next soundboard installation. Some tool marks are almost like fingerprints of a specific maker and can identify the actual workshop that produced an unmarked instrument. This has famously been exploited in the case of decorative moldings. This 1985 Atlas of Molding Profiles was compiled by Friedem and Helwig. It occurred to me some years ago that in the 18th century, number stamps were filed to shape by hand, so no two sets of number stamps would be exactly the same. Presumably, if you could catalog a set of signature details of a particular maker's set of number stamps, you can recognize when another instrument has all the same peculiarities, potentially leading to an attribution of an otherwise unsigned instrument. I was able to confirm a couple of attributions using that method as shown in the photo. The Colonial Williamsburg collection has that Zumpa square piano from 1766. It's an important instrument, being from the first year of piano production in the English-speaking world, and the year Zumpa's introduction of the square piano to British society. The instrument had almost miraculously escaped past restoration, and it represents a time when Zumpa's square piano was a brand new idea and still developing. You can almost see Zumpa scratching his head and debating different options, then starting one approach, but then changing his mind midstream and switching to a better one. I had the opportunity to make a very close copy of this instrument some years ago, and it was a great thrill to have so much evidence uncontaminated by restorations. And the evidence came in every form. Some design details were changed and reworked even during construction, so you could see his plan evolving even as he worked. Some historical evidence became apparent during and because of the replication process. Facing the same challenges experienced by Zumpa brought that creative moment in keyboard history to life, as if I were there. Some evidence became more understandable only when I examined another Zumpa piano of that same inaugural year, that piano in Calgary, Canada. That is evidence from comparative studies. In my copy of the 1766 Zumpa, I duplicated many rather primitive or awkward details that Zumpa soon abandoned, and I copied at least 2 alterations made to the original, possibly by Zumpa himself. The Zumpa copy was used for a CD recording just a few months ago in a project by Anders Muskens to explore the music of J.C. Bach, who, along with John Zumpa, was largely responsible for the sudden popularity of the new type of instrument in the 1760s. More recently, I was commissioned to make a copy of the 1793 harpsichord by Thomas Culliford and sold under the label Longman Broderip. The original, which had been purchased by George Washington for his Mount Vernon, was to be moved from the mansion to the new Mount Vernon Museum. The original harpsichord had been externally restored multiple times, but almost miraculously had escaped restoration of its musical interior. That meant it still retained even ephemeral components like original dampers, cloth and leather, and plectra. As a pristine document of harpsichord making at the culmination of the harpsichord era in Britain, the opportunity to read its physical evidence was truly extraordinary and is detailed in my Galpin Society journal article in the suggested reading list. I'll share just a few examples of interesting evidence. The original plectra survived in all 4 registers, surprisingly, were of leather from the beginning. Not hard leather, as we associate with a factory harpsichord from the early 20th century revival, but soft leather, more like the peau de buffle stop invented by Pascal Tasquin in Paris in the 1770s. This circumstance places the Mount Vernon harpsichord in an interesting moment in music history, when the piano had already surpassed the harpsichord in consumer preference. Indeed, the Washingtons already had a square piano before they ordered the harpsichord. This harpsichord thus represents a 1790s view of the harpsichord as a still evolving instrument that could be optimized to serve the emerging musical styles, which demanded more dynamic shading and expression. The original leather, now 2¼ centuries old, was obviously too weakened by age to allow us to test their use in a harpsichord. We did not attempt scientific analysis of the leather, which may someday provide useful clues, but given the lack of standardization in leather processing methods of the period, and the probability that the same material cannot be purchased or reliably reproduced today, we look to several other types of evidence. It can be readily observed, for example, that the profile of the plectra is thick and stubby, and we can see a thin layer of different leather is glued on top of the thicker substrate. Note the dark glue line between them. The center diagram shows how hard leather has to be voiced quite thin to work as plectra. But the profile we see in the antique harpsichord is like the diagram on the right. I tried numerous soft leathers, and most required more thinning than we saw in the original leather. There has to be enough give in the plectrum, so the string escapes the plectrum, as in the drawing on the right. This photo shows a selection of leathers and several batches of test plectra. That row of reproduction jacks on the right are all fitted to the same note on the harpsichord, each jack having a different combination of leather topping and substrate. That allowed rapidly comparing different types of leather plectra on the same note. After choosing one, I voiced a full rank of jacks accordingly, and consulting harpsichordist Joyce Lindorf came to my shop from Philadelphia to put it through the musical testing. We ultimately settled on a different type of leather. Latigo leather is tanned by 2 processes historically involving alum and gambier. It can be infused with oils and waxes to give more flexibility. After voicing the entire harpsichord with latigo leather to our musical satisfaction, the fact that the profile of the plectra also looked like the 1793 originals constituted a level of corroboration that we must be fairly close. In the search for evidence in this leather plectra episode, we thus relied on visual inspection, sources on historical tanning types, sources on period use of leather plectra, trial and error in choosing and voicing, and finally, subjective musical judgment. Did we get the final sound right? We can't ultimately know. But I can say, with some confidence, that we got one thing right. It is that our interpretations were not forced on the original instrument. That would have obliterated the evidence for future re-examination. The 1793 harpsichord remained untouched. Let's turn now to a sidebar topic we'll call historical mistakes. Did our historical instrument makers make mistakes? Of course they did. Much as we might lionize them and strive to duplicate their work, they were human. But I don't see most mistakes as detracting from the instrument, but rather offering a moment of connection as the humanity of a maker, who we try to see through the work of their hands, suddenly seems to come to life and something of his world. The Mount Vernon Harpsichord has a particularly bold error that hides in plain sight. The keyboard surround is highly decorated with diagonal crossbanding and marquetry. I had unquestioningly studied this harpsichord for some months before realizing an embarrassing mistake had been made during its construction. The designer of this decorative scheme intended to surround each panel with half-inch wide diagonal crossbanding, but something had gone wrong. At some point during the construction process, the two battens behind the upper and lower keyboard got switched. That meant there was almost no room for the diagonal crossbanding on the lower batten, and the upper batten had to get extra wide crossbanding to make it fit. This is the intended scheme for the crossbanding, consistently a half-inch in width. And here is what ended up being made. The two battens got switched. This raises two interesting questions for us. First, does this tell us anything interesting about workshop practice? It reinforced my expectation that the Culliford shop bought in the marquetry from a specialist, and that the panels were delivered just with the marquetry and not the crossbanding. So after the workman laboriously fit the first of the two battens, he realized he got off on the wrong foot and had to force fit the second one, compensating for the width of the crossbanding. Otherwise, if the marquetry shop had done the crossbanding, it would have been more obvious which panel to fit in which location. The other question for us is whether we should fix the mistake in the copy. What is your vote? I was of a split mind, considering that the next several generations of Mount Vernon visitors, and there are a lot of them, will be seeing my work, and I have my own pride to satisfy. That argued for fixing the mistake. Well, the decision was above my pay grade, so I emailed the curator at Mount Vernon, and the answer came back a few minutes later, by which time I knew what the answer should be. Copy the mistake. It simply defeats the purpose of representing the original instrument in the Mount Vernon mansion with a copy if we don't actually copy it. Harpsichord maker William Dowd was faced with a similar situation when he made a copy for the Smithsonian of this 1760 Stählin harpsichord in their collection. He reluctantly copied some bad workmanship in the keyframe and saved face by inscribing next to the spot, quote, "Bill Dowd could make a better joint than this, but apparently Stählin couldn't." But you might have noticed the reproduction has stop knobs that did not match the original. My decision to make engraved stop knobs was informed by two bits of evidence. You must know that George Washington has been arguably the single most revered American from the time he was still president of the United States in the late 18th century to the present day. Truth be told, we miss him more now than ever. His estate at Mount Vernon was a public shrine since it first opened for tourists in the middle of the 19th century. In its early days as a public museum, there was no such thing as museum guards and barrier ropes, and there were many losses as visitors took souvenirs. And what better souvenir than a nicely engraved ivory and brass knob, easily unscrewed and secured in a pocket? The other evidence was the dominance of these finely engraved ivory and brass stop knobs on other English harpsichords of a similar period and high style. So I copied what we believe to be the original state. If I missed the mark, it was in substituting bone for ivory. The marquetry suffered from multiple campaigns of resurfacing that removed some of the engraved shading. The upper image is the Mount Vernon marquetry, and the lower image is the almost identical details on the example in the Yale collection. Notice the differences in the black lines that shade the leaves and the flowers. The lines were created by carving into the veneer as if engraving, and the grooves then filled with black. Later refinishing and sanding caused some of the engraved detail to be lost in the Mount Vernon instrument. What does this indicate for our copy? Where before our goal had been to duplicate the mistakes made by the original makers, we were not trying to duplicate signs of wear. Our copy, therefore, follows the Yale shading more than the degraded Mount Vernon shading. We'll move now to a very different type of instrument and a different type of evidence. This is a piano made in Pennsylvania, not far from Philadelphia, and attributed to one John Clemm. It's an unusual example in almost every way, not the least because if what I have said so far about it is true, that the piano was made by John Clemm, it is far and away the earliest piano made in what would later become the USA. Moreover, it is a rare and newly discovered and well-preserved instrument by the maker widely considered the first professional keyboard instrument maker in the American colonies. Reasonable people could, and some have, refused to believe such an attribution is any more than a desperate historian's attempt to burnish his reputation by claiming an outlandishly improbable discovery. And yet here I am. The next question is, of course, what is the evidence? As Carl Sagan famously said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I'll leave it to my 2022 article about the instrument in the Journal of the American Musical Instruments Society to give a fuller description and analysis of the instrument, and to a companion article by John Koster in the same volume. For present purposes, I'll say only that the attribution of the instrument to John Clemm, and therefore a construction date before his 1762 death, is based on circumstantial evidence that is more convincing than any alternative. To summarize it in the briefest possible way, the instrument displays a constellation of design details that link it to Dresden, where John Clemm was trained in the first quarter of the 18th century. It was a time and place when a celebrated virtuoso named Pantaleon Hebenstreit had popularized his large hammered dulcimer, and the concept of fitting a keyboard to make such a difficult instrument easy for anyone to play was inevitable. Thus, independent of Cristofori's legitimate claims to have invented the piano in Italy at the same period, a different type of piano was also invented in Saxony. The 2019 book by Michael Latcham describes the Italian and the Saxon concepts as separate lineages that both began in the beginning of the 18th century and had distinct characteristics that intertwined in piano design over the course of the 18th century, eventually settling on a predominantly Cristofori-oriented concept by the early 19th century. The little Pennsylvania upright piano falls easily into the Saxon concept and not in the Cristofori concept. Like a hammered dulcimer, it allows switching between hard and soft hammers. And like a hammered dulcimer, it can be played without any damping, though less than half of the strings do have dampers that can nevertheless be turned off. These Hebenstreit-inspired characteristics are agnostic of Cristofori's concept, and it is the Hebenstreit-inspired characteristics that were in John Clemm's head when he landed in America from Saxony well before pianos were known anywhere outside of those early European experiments. My research report to the museum considers each of the known candidates who could possibly have possessed skills enough to produce this instrument. And only Clemm came of age as a professional keyboard instrument maker in the region and in the era of the advent of the Saxon lineage. The article lists some physical evidence in the instrument, but it is mostly based on this circumstantial evidence that this unusual instrument appears remarkably to be a fossil from the beginnings of European piano history, despite its long residence in a small town in Pennsylvania. Or perhaps the instrument went relatively unnoticed and unaltered because of its safe harbor in a small town in Pennsylvania. Now a closing thought. Have you ever thought about how our work is similar to what astronomers do? They examine the heavens and fix their attention on a tiny speck that is some celestial object a billion light years away. They know they're actually seeing something that took place a billion years ago, and yet it adds to their understanding of a constantly developing universe as it was at that time. I hope it's clear how examining some old tool marks or other evidence of workshop practice is like that. It's almost literally time travel to see an 18th century artisan's every stroke of his draw knife, and like the astronomer, we add that keyhole glimpse of the past to our ever-growing knowledge of that world. Can we fully embody that past in the reproduction musical instruments we make and play today? That is our aspiration. And may the aspirations be with you. With that, I'll turn it back to our hosts.
Well, thank you so much, John, for that. And it's absolutely fascinating to learn a little bit more about exactly what goes on when we're thinking about these historical instruments and how we can rebuild them, and some of the challenges that are faced. And if anybody does have any questions, then please feel free to write them in the chat, and we can discuss that a bit further. But if actually I could just start off with a question for you, John, is thinking a bit more about some of these challenges that you might face when thinking about reproducing these instruments. What do you think maybe some of the biggest challenges are in this area? And do you think as we learn more about the affordances of these instruments, and as technology grows in what we can do you think that there will be some new opportunities that can improve the process of rebuilding these instruments?
To take the first part of your question about what the biggest challenges are, I think it has to do with the concept of systems theory, and I think systems theory is really very much a big part of what the remake project is about. It's that an instrument is a product of its world, not just of one maker. And so the challenge, that's a lot for us to take in, the concept of a zoom lens, zooming out and looking at the whole environment that the instrument was made in, is a challenge. There's a lot to see there. There's a lot of evidence to process. So I think that's probably the biggest challenge. As far as new innovations or technologies that can help us in this process, we're fortunate to live in a scientific age, and there's a constantly growing number of scientific analysis that's being developed, and an enormous amount standing ready to show us more about these objects, because we can look closer now than we've ever been able to look before. But in terms of innovations and technologies, today I chose to show actually some pretty old school, old tech, low tech methods of examination, because I think there's a great deal that can be picked up even that way.
Yes, no, absolutely, yes. I get what you're saying, and it's interesting that you should talk a bit about more the old school methods as well. I know when you talked a bit about your linking, sort of linking, knowing through making, and I was just wondering what other benefits and insights that we could gain from reproducing these instruments, in addition to, say, talking and learning about the past, and we can understand how these instruments may have operated their environment, but also just thinking a bit more about the future as well, thinking about maybe by doing this, can we perhaps, learn some new techniques for building instruments in the future?
Well, certainly one of the side benefits of the kind of research that we're doing is coming to understand some historical craft traditions that were actually lost with the Industrial Revolution, when nobody was doing things that way. And so we're in a slow process of trying to piece together what was lost during that period. So that's a benefit as we reconstruct historical methods. That example that I gave of the method of gluing in the soundboard using the strips. We saw the evidence in the antique, and that really taught me a method that I hadn't thought of that turned out to be great. And it was an example of this, really learning how today we can do better by rediscovering the way they did it in the period.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And also thinking a bit about like the we talked mostly about your two different instruments that you had worked on. And do you think that your approach for studying and rebuilding these instruments changes depending on how much information and scholarship you have available? And say if you're working with an instrument where there is less historical information available, how do you go about filling in the blanks, as it were, and understanding what should be left in, what potentially should be left out?
Well, certainly any kind of literature that's been produced relevant to the process ahead of me is a huge benefit. But one of my own peculiarities is that I find it rather more compelling to dive into a project when I'm on my own, when this has really not been figured out yet. And so there's, I don't know, it kind of it gives a little adrenaline, I guess, to think and test and try things out that just doesn't come when you can read somebody else's article and they've already figured it out, and there's a little less provocation there to figure it out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just following on from that, I can see a question in the chat I'd just like to read out to you, asking, how do we bring these craft traditions back into the mainstream world? And so it's great to have instruments in museums as copies, but how does Josephine Bloggs in the middle of nowhere conservatoire learn about these important elements?
Well, I think there's probably a number of historic sites in Europe as there are in the US, and certainly the one that I worked at for the last 35 years is a living history museum, which preserves not only the objects from the past, but the crafts. So we have in Williamsburg a number of uh, workshops that really work in this sort of historical method. And there's a great deal of research involved and learning that could go on there. So, and we have visitors, hundreds of visitors every day that come through and see that happening. And it's happening, of course, in many places in Europe as well. The whole concept of um, experimental archaeology is at play in many places, and there's a great deal to be learned.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I agree, and I think it's very important to get this out to as many people as possible as it were. And following on from that, just another question I can see in the chat is: do you think that the rediscovery of alternative piano lineages could inspire new composition for historical keyboard instruments today, not as a reconstruction, but more as a continuation?
Hmm. Well, we used to, when I think back of the early days of the early music revival. That is, in my lifetime, in the 1970s, it seemed, 1960s and 70s, there was an explosion of interest. And the books that came out at that time, again, my specialty in keyboard instruments. So I'm thinking about the Russell book, 1959, and then the Hubbard book of 1965, and so forth. Each of them treated the history of harpsichords as this is how they made them in Italy, and here's how they made them in England, and here's how they made them in Flanders, and so forth. But what I've gradually learned over my career, and I think we're all learning, is that any one antique instrument that you look at doesn't just represent a sort of monolithic tradition from one place and one period, but every instrument is actually transitional. You know, the evolution of instruments over time has been continuous, and really the Mount Vernon harpsichord was a good example of that for me, because there we were seeing a harpsichord that was not just, you know, not just a harpsichord that lost its way by using leather for all the plectra, but actually it was a harpsichord that was made for the music of the time in the 1790s, which was a different kind of music than, you know, what we think of as Baroque music.
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yes, I agree. And that's like really fascinating how very much it is a continuation and perhaps we're just a part of that. And on that note, I know Max, who is part of the Remake project, would you like to say something here, Max, about that?
Yes. First of all, thanks, John, for this very insightful and exciting trip into the galaxy of musical instruments and addressing complexity and creating new ways of seeing things that are hidden. It's a main part of Remake. But I think you said something that is even more important to us because you spoke about subjective judgment that is still essential to understanding because it is an embodied knowledge, what you experience and generate while looking at an historical instrument. But you also said this interpretation cannot be forced over the original instrument and should be used as a driven new creative energy for building a copy. That is even my own interpretation of that particular instrument. So you implicitly said that the present of instrument building is necessary for keeping up the tradition, and the present of musicians, it's necessary for inhabiting these ecologies that we are creating in order to transmit it to the future. So my question is, what about the training of instrument builders? How do you see this kind of very professionally, high specialized training going that is rooted in artisanal knownship, but also it's characterized by modernity and post-modernity technologies and behaviors?
Well, Max, I think you've put your finger on one of the really worrisome things in the situation we find ourselves in, because there really is, speaking for this side of the Atlantic, there's really a worrisome lack of opportunities for training. And I think I've heard at times that it's not unlike that in Europe as well. And actually, I think you've also put your finger on the most fantastic thing about the Remake project. Yeah, it's really something you've devoted yourself to, and you know, as an old guy at the end of his career, I despair a little bit. There was so much excitement and discovery going on in a few years ago, and I've despaired a little bit that it seems like there's so much less now. But Remake has completely changed that calculation, and it looks like there's some fantastic hope. So I wish you all luck, and I hope there's a real renaissance. I think you're poised to make that happen.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you very much, and we're very grateful for all that, and hopefully the good vibes of Remake will continue as well. I'd just say another question in the chat as well for Mimi. Mimi, you're very much welcome to unmute and speak as well if you'd like to, because it's an interesting question, I think, just leading on a little bit from what we were talking about here was, does this put into a different light early pioneers of the early keyboard revival, like Dolmetsch, who believed that the development of these instruments was incomplete and that modern times should continue that development?
Sorry, just to say that certainly the impression that that you get if you read what Dolmetsch wrote about early instruments, and you can also do what you did and look at the instruments themselves and see that that's what he believed by examining his instruments. It's just that you said that we should look at all of these instruments as objects in transition, and that kind of sums up the way Dolmetsch looked at them, in part. And it was quite different from others of the time who believed there was almost something sacred about the antique. They should only be taken out of their cases to be examined and perhaps played, but then they should be put back into their cases again. So our century didn't, the 20th century certainly didn't, in the end, adopt that idea of instruments being in transition. Whereas, Dolmetsch looked on these as very lively instruments to be fiddled with now. And so he made lots of interesting things, all of which were, in the end, economic failures. But he still had that state of mind.
Thank you, Mimi. Yeah, I think that sort of shift of thinking, first, the instrument is the historic instrument is the gold standard that we want to try to reach, and then shifting to a concept that no, we can go past that, we can go beyond that, as you're saying, Dolmetsch was saying. I noticed the same shift happening in the 1970s. If you are old enough to think back to that, there was a period of great competition. All of us trying to be more authentic than now. There's this great emphasis on authenticity.
Oh, I remember it well.
Yeah. Yeah. And by the early 1980s, that was kind of passé, and makers were ready to say, well, we know we figured them out, and we know the first principles now, and so we can pick up where they left off, and we can develop, we could make instruments better than the antiques because we understand what they were after. Mm-hmm. I grieve about that a little bit, because even as that attitude was shifting in that direction, there was also this, I was seeing a great increase in the potential for learning from the antique instruments. But so many people were kind of losing interest in the antique instruments before that really took hold.
Well, I think the point for me about Dolmetsch was that there is I'm not sure how to put this, because I've never ever articulated it before, but I think there's a mismatch between his aesthetic ideal, which produced his instrument, and the aesthetic ideal that produced the instruments of when the harpsichord was a more mainstream instrument. And I think that's where the maybe that's the nub of the problem there, or the reason why his instruments were found to be problematic, his and others that were so-called modernizing the harpsichord, because they were applying an aesthetic, a modern aesthetic, to something that was made according to other aesthetic ideals, including music.
I suspect we could probably agree that the common theme here we're seeing in all periods is that the instrument it gained its meaning from its context, from its time and place. So Dolmage's instruments made the best sense when he was making them. And you could look at and the Mount Vernon Harpsichord made the best sense in the 1790s. In America, we had the most knowledgeable harpsichord maker restorer in 1950 was John Challis, and he pushed this idea very, very far, going to metal soundboards and applying to the harpsichord all the technologies it missed out on in the 19th century, and his work was very much of its time. So that's universally true of whether you're talking about 1685, 1785, 1885, or the present.
Can I just ask you a really practical question about the leather plectra that went into the color for Longman Broderip? But can you say anything about the longevity of it? I mean, how has it lasted? How does it change with use, or does it change with use?
I can't answer that. I don't know. I'm not aware of, and I'm not with the instrument on a regular basis. I'm not aware of changes that have occurred with it since we did the work a few years ago. But it's reminding me a little bit, that question of kind of an advantage of being in the business kind of as long as I have. Some of the instruments that I made, like that Zumpo reproduction, was actually 1993. And so by observing it's been used ever since. And by observing its aging process over that first period is quite interesting, because we look at an English harpsichord and think, oh, they didn't do very well with framing, did they? Because they developed this kind of cocked cheek. But make an accurate copy and watch it for 30 years. And see how well it would have survived through the rest of the harpsichord era. And I think what we would learn is, oh, they weren't so bad at the framing.
No, indeed, that's absolutely fascinating, I think. And Johan, I can see, do you have a question that you would like to ask or comment?
Who are you addressing?
So is my microphone on? Can you hear me?
It is, yes.
Okay, thank you. We are just sharing the space with Joel, so I think he turned on the speaker. Thank you. Thank you, John. Very well thought through as usual and very pedagogical. Thank you. Very interesting questions also. So if we leave the idea of improving, but have you any thoughts about what kind of challenges you will meet if you leave the path of an original instrument and try to kind of work within the frame by changing certain things? Where is your experience about finding problems you didn't know about? Because if you have an original and try to copy that, you are maybe safer. That's at least my impression.
Yeah, I think that's, if I understand the question, I think that was partly the point of my first example of the clavichord that I made. There were consequences to me varying from the model that I was copying, because I didn't understand yet. I'd like to maybe take the opportunity to draw a parallel, which I find very interesting. Making a reproduction, a copy of an antique harpsichord, has a lot in common with a performance, a historically informed performance. We learn what we can. We do our best to make a musical result within the boundaries of what we know about the period. And in that way, they're very similar. What's the most different thing about a historically informed performance versus a historically informed reproduction harpsichord is that the performance can be more enlightened than yesterday's performance. And tomorrow, when I learn more, it could be changed again. Whereas the reproduction kind of mostly freezes that understanding of that you had at the moment that the reproduction was made. In that sense, another parallel is that making a reproduction of an antique instrument is a lot like writing a scholarly article. It's putting in physical form the state of your knowledge about history up to that moment.
Yeah, thank you. Of course, yeah. Nicely put. And then, of course, maybe we here in Gothenburg should build another North German Baroque organ to see what we learn.
Every year.
Every year. Thank you.
Yes, no, indeed. Yes, well, why not? If the money is there, why not? And just going on from that, just a little bit, a question actually I had in my mind was thinking about how do you think that meaning making and embodiment are impacted by originality? And so, for example, like how do you decide when an instrument that you're rebuilding has like a sufficiently original sound if we can't really know what it did sound like? How do you sort of like come to a decision there of when you think that okay, this is appropriate for what we're trying to aim at?
I hope it's not a complete cop-out to say that we really can't know how close we've come to the original sound. But whether you're talking about the originality of the historical maker or of the copy maker, our instruments have to make music in the end. I'm not sure I quite followed your question, but those are just thoughts that come to mind.
Oh no, absolutely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, especially thinking about what we do in the remake project, you know, there's a lot of us, and we have a lot of different experiences and maybe ideas about what we would do. And you know, let's say it's not like a one person show, as it were. So have you ever like in any of your work in say situations where you have to manage contrasting inputs from different groups, say if you're talking with different builders or performers or something like that, and maybe they have different ideas, have you ever like been in any of these situations where you have to maybe think about actually I need to make a decision here around an instrument?
That's such a terrific question. When I was a few years ago, there was a conservation graduate school. They used to make annual pilgrimages to our conservation labs at Colonial Williamsburg. And when the group came to my lab, I'd gather them around a badly deteriorated antique and to consider whether it should be restored. But first, I give each student a slip of paper describing what role play they're going to do, what kind of person they're going to represent in this discussion. So one would be assigned to be a museum financial officer, concerned about the cost of this. Another concert manager who doesn't care a thing about preserving historical evidence. He just wants to get the show on the road. Another is a music lover, and another is a music maker studying how this historical maker made harpsichords 300 years ago. The students then would discuss and argue, debate about whether and how the instrument should be restored. And invariably, they really got into it because they came away realizing just how different the perspective is from these different kinds of stakeholders. So there is a huge difference of perspectives, and you can say that let's see, what is the phrase? The person who pays the piper calls the tune. So someone hires the restorer and they have a certain voice in the matter. But truly, when I'm faced with a conflict of interest, I can't bring myself to violate historical evidence that's so irrecoverable in restoration. And I think generally making a reproduction is far and away the better thing to do when the instrument is of extreme historical rarity and importance.
and that you've done extremely well in defining in your book Artifacts in Use. When we have organs that need to be played in order to survive, all of those questions get more difficult. And we're very grateful for the careful thinking that you've done about those. I just wanted to jump back to your beautiful, beautiful pictures of those keys with the grazing light, to have us understand how really simple documentation processes can reveal the most wonderful information about workshop practice if you are engaged in the practice yourself. The documentation that you could make about how that process of working on the keys could be explored in the copy, I think, was really wonderful. And one of the things we're struggling with is that we're hoping that modern technology can deal with the complexity of handcraft. It's a sort of so far a kind of a fond hope that we have in this project, where we've been working with even some of Keith Hill's ideas about tuning materials, and there the kinds of tool marks that are left could be the key in an untouched original to ask completely new questions of material. I just wonder whether you have, you've done a brilliant job of documenting your relationship to this in the article on the Mount Vernon instrument by saying you don't skip over a detail if you don't know what it's for. Copy it if you don't know what it's for, and you will find out what it's for. That's something that we have lived by here in Göteborg too. Do you see any? If you had to document those workshop marks again, is there anything you would do differently? I can give you another sort of just one more little prompt that's in my head. The giant gap between what we can see because we're makers or we use our hands, and how we can communicate that information, I think, is where I'm quite engaged at the moment. Whether we can find new ways of communicating to new audiences what we see with our hands without having to have other people use their hands. Maybe it's not possible.
No, I don't think it is. Without some actually, I think it could be the phenomenon can be described, which what I was attempting to do today. And some people, I assume in this gathering, are not people who have used those tools to make keys or anything. So the question, I guess the question could be to them, in hearing those words and seeing those pictures, does it kind of make sense? Do you see the point? But as far as being able to describe the tools and how they were used, or my interpretation of it, certainly can't impart to the listener that same kind of understanding.
I hope it invites and inspires people to become engaged physically with these instruments as players and as builders, because that is where the adrenaline that inspires you to do this work kicks in for everybody. I can just tell one tiny anecdote, because it's about Carola Snyder, whose 90th birthday is tomorrow. Mrs. Buxtehude is celebrating her 90th birthday, and she worked diligently to make my dissertation readable as one of my Doktormutters. And she said, the only thing I want as payment is, when we're done, I want one lesson at the North German organ. And I showed her what I was talking about in terms of clavichord technique at the organ. And after 6 years, she said, "Oh, now I get it."
So it doesn't take much.
It didn't take much, but it took a physical engagement, and she's a very clever person. So we have to find. We're hoping with Remake to make microecologies that actually get people to do hands-on things, and we're hoping to have these good minds help develop ways for people to experience that adrenaline kick that you described so brilliantly. Thank you.
Yeah, and just leading on from what you and Joel were just talking about, it's I always feel it's a challenge for even those of us who aren't fabulous builders like yourself and Joel, but have spent a lot of time looking at how these instruments, these historical instruments, are changed during their lifetime to meet new requirements of music as they go through time, and finding a way to communicate that to performers as well as builders. What happens when you move this pivot point or this balance element? And I mean, you have worked on so many projects with instruments like this that are then played a lot. Do you have any insight for us onto how we can learn to speak to the performers that you are so experienced at talking to already? How do we develop that language?
Oh dear. I met who in the audience knows what I should be saying right now? Somebody does. I don't have an answer for that.
Oh, I've had some. I mean, I don't know if this is not an answer, but this just contributes to the question in a way, because I've been in the position of having to introduce many people, hundreds, to playing different types of early keyboard instruments in my capacity at Fenton House, where there were so many different types there, and people came with very very fixed ideas often about what a harpsichord or clavichord should feel like. And it was very it was the unique player, or well, not unique, rare player, who could immediately adjust their touch and get in their ideas together quickly enough by playing a few notes. One of the things that helps that I found is actually talking to people about the differences in keyboards and balance points, and using simple levers just to prove a point to them, taking the weight off one key of a lower manual on an English harpsichord and showing them what happens, and telling them what would happen in a French harpsichord instead, or in an Italian. And sometimes they can digest that. Sometimes they need to go away and work with the ideas. And it's no reflection on how good or otherwise the player is. It's just a matter of being able to manipulate your own habits and your expectations. So children are actually very good because they come with so few expectations that they're quite safe if there's somebody around. But it's the sort of the hardened professionals, which are often the most difficult. But sometimes just telling them, the principles, the physical principles that you've learned, can help them.
I think that's wonderful, Mimi, and I see a real parallel in what John described so brilliantly about not looking at a historical keyboard instrument and saying that must be a mistake. I know better, because that's where some of the people you just described as hardened professionals also could be opened up to say just have a dialogue with this and see if we start from the position that maybe it's not a mistake, maybe it's a key to understanding the microecology around that instrument and its music, and that's so So sometimes parallel descriptions, like John's description of the details of the instrument, also just from the side, like that grazing light, come in and help people just have a new open understanding. And so thank you so much for that, Mimi. That was really lovely.
So one small thing is if we can talk to people who teach as well, because they feel like sometimes they feel like they need to be authoritative, and it's a burden. And if we can relieve them of the burden of being an authority and take the same exploratory attitude that we feel when we come to look for the first time at an instrument we haven't seen before, then they can help reduce the burden on their students, which they come to adopt as, they adopt it from the people who are teaching them.
Yes, no, absolutely. And that's like really interesting to see how I think in a way this what we talk about enters very many spheres. Say if we can talk about this from a performance view, from a builder's point of view, but an educator's point of view, and they can all have very different ideas, but in a way they all link back into, this one instruments and the aims that we have. And I think very much goes back to being a continuous process, and that's something that hopefully at the Remake project we will be able to continue on doing and advance in the future. And with that being said, we're very close now to the end, so we'd just like to start wrapping up. And just first of all, just say thank you, John, for all your time and your really insightful talk and everything. It's been really, really fascinating, and it's great, I think, for our first seminar series to have you here, and we're very, very happy about that. This will be a monthly event. We're just finalizing our speakers very soon in the future, so please keep an eye out for an email and other notifications about that. And obviously you're all very welcome back. And with that being said, I'd just like Max or Joel or anybody else from the Remake team, if there's anything else you would like to add.
Yeah, if I can, I'd just like to thank again John for starting this research platform, and sharing these ideas was really a mantra for Remake. And I think we already start having a benchmark of new tools that we could develop during this project in order to foster this dialogue and to create maybe also through technology some toolkits that could be very useful for teaching and for experiencing historical instruments or bits and pieces of that complex machines in different ways. But it's not just creating something technologically innovative, is more to create something significant for communities that should talk to each other. So the idea of brainstorming about what toolkit Remake should work on in order to facilitate this kind of knowledge transmission is part of the Remake seminars, and that's why we will have different expertise in the next talks, and we try to keep it together and to have the conversation ongoing. So we will create a mailing list, we will have a blog where these thoughts can be flashed up, and please go on and share with us the enthusiasm for this project, because we are really making something together. Thank you.
And maybe Bina can have the final word. I can read what she just wrote in the chat. For me as a teacher, the instrument is my co-teacher, and when I am alone, my inspiring musical partner. So good instruments give me all the inspiration.
Yes, I think that is a pretty excellent quote upon which to end this, and how very much indebted we are to all our musical instruments that we work with as well. So just again, thank you everybody once again for attending, and again finally thank you, John, very much for being the first person to present at our seminar series. As I say, this will be a monthly event, so keep an eye out for an email and other notifications. We'll be back here in a month, and yes, thank you very much.